And I think we can get started and we'll start recording. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center and the director of Public Funds Public Schools. Public Funds Public Schools, which is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund, is dedicated to ensuring that public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen our public schools. You can visit our website at pfps.org for more info and sign up for updates on our contact page. And if you're tweeting about this webinar, you can tag PFPS. This event in our webinar series, which is entitled State Advocacy to Fight Vouchers and Protect Public Schools, is a follow-up to our recent webinar on 2021 state voucher bills and tools to fight them, which is available as a recording on our website. And we're so excited to have all the wonderful advocates on our panel tonight. We will also record this webinar, and we ask that you put questions in the Q&A box rather than in the chat, and our moderator will ask many of those questions at the end of the event. So I have the honor of introducing today's moderator, Sujith Cherukumilli. And Sujith is the Government Affairs and Advocacy Analyst at the Southern Education Foundation, an Atlanta-based civil rights organization that traces its roots to Reconstruction. At SEF, Sujith helps advance the organization's government affairs work and advocates for SEF's policy priorities in Georgia, throughout the South, and at the federal level. Thanks so much, Sujith. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here this evening. We have a great conversation ahead of us. As Jessica shared, my name is Sujith Cherukumilli, and I'm the Government Affairs and Advocacy Analyst at the Southern Education Foundation in Atlanta. Before we dive in tonight, I want to acknowledge the brutal and heartless hate crime carried out in Atlanta yesterday evening that stole the lives of 8 people, including 6 Asian American women. It's top of mind for me and may be for many of you as well. Hate crimes and violence against communities of color in the United States, including the AAPI community, have been a dark part of our nation's history since its founding, and it is unacceptable. So as we talk about organizing for equity in public education tonight, let's also think about how we can continue organizing for education justice for all our students of color, and how we can collectively root out the scourge of white supremacy in all its forms. And let's be sure to hold space for our East and Southeast Asian brothers and sisters in the coming days and weeks. This evening's conversation is especially important because in 2021, we find ourselves in a unique moment for public education. We're seeing the light at the end of the pandemic's long, dark tunnel, and advocates and policymakers are reckoning with how to seize this opportunity to make our public schools more equitable and innovative. However, using the pandemic and school closures as cover, voucher proponents and pro-voucher lawmakers have introduced a record number of voucher bills in states all over the country during the 2021 legislative session, 9 pages worth of privatization bills on Public Funds Public Schools online voucher bill tracker. In the 4 states represented by our panelists alone, we have seen over 25 voucher or voucher-related bills this legislative session. Now, advocates like the ones on this panel are working hard to push back against these harmful bills and urging their state leaders to prioritize public education. While our panelists from this evening are from organizations based in Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, and Georgia, the insights they'll share are applicable to national advocates and advocates in other states facing the threat of school privatization. As we've heard on previous webinars hosted by Public Funds Public Schools, the negative impacts of vouchers are universal and far outweigh any purported benefits. They're expensive, inequitable, and harmful to public schools and the millions of students who attend them. This evening, we'll be hearing from our panelists who have expertise in all of these issue areas on how we can collectively and effectively counter the seemingly ceaseless voucher legislation we're seeing all over the country this year, and how we can lay the groundwork for a nation where the only type of school funded by taxpayers is a public school. Without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce this amazing group of panelists we have this evening. Amanda Hollowell is the Director of Strategic Campaigns for the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. She has been an organizer and community advocate much of her career and is excited about bringing more people into the fold of education funding advocacy. Next, we have Sharon Kirsch, who is a co-founder and director of research for Save Our Schools Arizona, a nonpartisan, community-based organization fighting for strong public schools in every community across Arizona. Next, we have Bill Kopsky, who is the executive director of the Arkansas Public Policy Panel, a 54-year-old 501c3 nonprofit that helps Arkansas families and residents improve their communities and develop policy solutions by taking collective action and building coalitions. Next, we have Stephen Owens, who is a senior policy analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, where he focuses on state policies and research that affect public K-12 education in Georgia. And last, but certainly not least, we have Reverend Rachel Gunter Shepard, who is the co-founder of Pastors for Florida Children, a public education advocacy group in the Sunshine State that was formed in 2019. She also serves as regional vice president for the Together for Hope Rural Development Coalition in the Black Belt. Welcome to all of our great panelists. So without further ado, we can go ahead and dive into our conversation. Reverend Shepard, we will start with you. Florida, as you know, has the most robust framework for private school vouchers in the country, spending over $1 billion annually on private school vouchers. What are organizers in your state doing to counter the decades-long narrative that vouchers are an effective use of taxpayer dollars?
Well, there has been a lot going on in our state for many years, as you noted. And first, I think I would be remiss if I didn't note that there are many allies around the subject of public education in Florida. So Pastors for Florida Children is just one of many. Florida PTA, Fund Education Now, Florida Council of Churches, League of Women Voters. We have so many that are working on this. And I would say, and all of us have stances on opposition regarding vouchers. And so when we come out of our individual silos and we band together, we are at our strongest. And so that has been a huge part of the work that we do. Education is always a big piece as well. People may know that education funding is not in good shape in the state, but they may not understand exactly where it is. And so, we talk about it sometimes that in Florida, we're basically on life support when it comes to funding and for public education. So the majority of parents, grandparents, community stakeholders just do not understand how desperate the funding crisis is. And so we have to utilize a lot of our efforts around education, bringing that out, helping them understand exactly where this stands so that they can become advocates as well, encouraging them into the work. So part of that is writing op-eds. We want to get the word out in the press. So again, our community stakeholders can have a better sense of that. And also really just to call people to account, our legislators, and say, hey, we're watching, we know what's going on, and we're against this. We're also taking time to alert parents and public ed advocates of times when they can take action. So when there are bills that are being heard in committees, letting them know so that they can make calls, so that they can send emails. And if they are able, we try to raise funds so that they can come to the Capitol. Florida's a long state with the Panhandle and then all the way down to South Florida. And sometimes we only have a few days when we're alerted of bills. And so we try to have funds available to help parents and others get there if they would like to testify themselves. The last thing I would say is, Senator Thurston, one of our state senators, described the current voucher bill that's in our state, SB 48. It's flown through 3 committees, but he described it as a death knell for public education in Florida, that this will be the ultimate undoing of our public schools. So one thing personally I have, and many of our advocates in the state have gotten a little more bold about, is explicitly asking people to consider who they are voting on when they go to the polls and the stance that people are taking regarding public education. What are their voting records when it comes to bills on public education? Because our legislators are not voting in the way that we would think our people would expect them to. Public education is not and should not be considered a partisan issue. And yet when you look at how our legislators are voting, that's what we're seeing. And so beginning to call them out and say, look, between 2008 and 2018, public ed funding has decreased by 30% in our state. That's not okay. Our Republican grandparents and parents have people in public school, and we've got people all across the political spectrum, right? Republicans, Democrats, everywhere in between. All of us want our public schools to be strong. And so we really need to speak with our vote. And if people within our own party that we, have an identity with are not voting in that way, then we need to find some new candidates and bring some new folks into those seats, because it's that important. Our children's future is at stake.
Speak with our vote. I love that. Thank you for that, Reverend Shepherd. Sharon, the next question is for you. So as you know, Sharon, a bill recently passed the Arizona Senate that would allow the size of Arizona's voucher program to balloon, despite voters rejecting a similar measure in 2018. And so this kind of touches on that divide between voters and lawmakers that Reverend Shepherd was talking about. So I wanted to ask you, how are organizations like yours holding pro-voucher lawmakers accountable when their legislative priorities are different from what the voters of Arizona want?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I want to just say a big thanks to Public Funds, Public Schools for holding this event and for supporting the work that's happening in our states, and also for connecting us to each other, because sometimes this grassroots organizing can be a little bit lonely and you have your nose to the grindstone, and it's good to know that other people are fighting these fights. So I appreciate the question, because Save Our Schools Arizona formed around fighting a massive voucher expansion in 2017, when a group of pissed off moms, me being one of them, began to realize that it was well-funded out-of-state special interests like DeVos's American Federation for Children, Koch-funded groups like Americans for Prosperity, and their latest focus, which has a lobbyist in Arizona for Yes, Every Kid. They are driving education policy in Arizona, and policies that we now know very, very well are part of a systematic national effort to privatize public education. So the fact that these pro-voucher lawmakers have held a majority in both chambers in Arizona for a very long time makes it difficult for us to hold them accountable. For decades in Arizona, privatizers have just had carte blanche, like open enrollment, you got it. Charters that are in no way accountable to their communities and make millions for their often for-profit parent companies, you got it. Massive tax credits for private school vouchers, got it. Expand ESAs exponentially year after year, got it. So it really wasn't until Save Our Schools Arizona, a grassroots movement that was really building the plane as we were flying, trying to figure out how all this worked, referred this bill to the 2018 ballot, and that we really actually managed to put the brakes on this stuff for the first time in our state. And Arizona voters voted 2-1 against voucher expansion. We know that people in Arizona support public education. It's our lawmakers who do not listen to their constituents. And so once again, we are fighting this massive voucher expansion. And I just testified on the bill this morning. And so this voucher expansion in our state would expand our ESA vouchers, which we call in Arizona empowerment scholarship account vouchers, to 600,000 of our 1.1 million students. And this is in addition to our tax credit programs, quadrupling, this is another bill, tax credit funding for private school tuition. So Save Our Schools Arizona has been really focused on deep organizing over the next 2 years in order to help Arizona voters develop a better understanding of how the legislative process works here, how they can engage, with the ultimate goal of ensuring that communities across the state vote for lawmakers who will prioritize public education and keep the public in our public schools. So we're being more explicit now about who the enemies of public education are in our state, and we're helping voters connect the dots around which lawmakers genuinely support public education and which do not.
So it sounds like you have a very strong voter engagement effort happening in Arizona around this issue as well. That's great to hear. Stephen, we'll move on to you for the next question. So as both of us know very well, Georgia has experienced quite the battle this year when it comes to school vouchers. Thankfully, groups in the state, including yours, banded together to recently defeat House Bill 60, which would have introduced a brand new ESA in the state. Can you talk to us about how some of your allies in the state and how you and some of your allies have coordinated throughout the 2021 legislative session to make such a victory possible?
Yeah, I'll do my best, and way to bury the lead there, because SCF was such a great partner and all that. I mean, we are happy to be on a letter that you authored. And so first, to Reverend Shepard's point, there's so many people that we rely on for fights like this. I mean, and so many of our kids go to public schools. Those are connected to families, communities, neighbors. I mean, it really is a bipartisan issue when you get down to who wants public schools to do well. So when it comes to brass tacks of who we rely on in these fights, I mean, we are always grateful for the great work of our teacher groups, Professional Association of Georgia Educators, Georgia Association of Educators. There's a lot of school leader groups that are able to tap into politically powerful superintendents in Georgia that are willing to call their lawmakers and speak on our behalf. Public Education Matters, PTA groups. And it really is, it's a bigger fight than just during session, isn't it? Because what it looks like is a proactive agenda, so that we're not just being against something, we're showing what the gaps are and how the state ought to be moving forward versus kind of just the things that we hope to avoid. And so GBPI is unique in this fight because we don't really have a constituency of our own. We strive to be an anti-racist research and advocacy organization. And so we really do rely on our great partners and are very jealous of the Pastors for Florida's Children and the work that we've seen in Pastors for Texas Children, great coalition in Arizona that we've been relying on y'all's work for so long. But what this looks like is during session, having regular information sharing meetings with partners, and then hearing what do they need and how can we address that need. So I'm always trying to listen to like what are several comm strategies, because we're always going to hit on that line that public funds is for public schools. And absolutely, yes, that carries the largest weight, but there's so many reasons to oppose policies like these, not to mention their racist history, the lack of protections for students with disabilities once they go to a private school that doesn't receive federal dollars. And so we try to be really humble about our work and just supporting those other groups that have large constituencies and that can make their voice known in that space. One thing that I spend a lot of time on is, just because of the work that I do in a budget advocacy organization, is try to zoom in on the nuance. No one is going to devise some perfect voucher that impacts every school evenly, right? And education funding is so complex that there's always going to be one part of the state, one group of students that is hurt worse than others. So being able to kind of zoom in on those areas and say, oh, you have a straight dollar amount for this voucher, that means that's going to hurt the schools that rely more on state funding. Oh, you're going to have it adjusted based on the state allocation. Okay, that means that states that require more are going to be hurt more. And we were able to see this in a recent voucher fight where they had changed the bill at the last second of how it is allocated. And it meant that our rural schools were going to be paying like twice as much than our suburban Atlanta schools. And that's a death knell for some of our rural partners, Republicans and Democrat. And so just trying to find that nuance and then zooming out with the help of Amanda, our comms department that you'll hear later, to really show like, okay, how do we take this nuance and apply it larger? How do we put this in the hands of our partners and be able to say this better, than we're going to be able to say, because I know that nobody's going to listen to a guy with these glasses sitting in an ivory tower about, what's best for their kids, but really getting it to those impacted communities and hearing from them on what do they need in order to take this across the finish line.
That's very powerful, the grassroots inclusive approach that you mentioned. That's definitely something we'll be talking about a little bit more over the course of this webinar. So thanks for uplifting that. Amanda, the next question is for you. So Amanda, as you know, the expansion of vouchers in Georgia and throughout the southern states aligned almost perfectly with the civil rights movement. Despite this troubling past, we often hear advocates on the other side of this issue using race as a justification when they're trying to push a new voucher bill through. That's often the first time we hear them talking about students of color on these committee meetings and in state legislatures. And so particularly in the wake of a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted kids of color and in the aftermath of historic protests in defense of and in support of Black lives, how are anti-voucher advocates such as yourself in Georgia talking about the issue of race and private school choice? And what have been some of the challenges associated with bringing this issue to the forefront?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. That is a heavy question today, right? So, and I want to be careful how I answer it, but I recently saw an advocate do a Twitter thread about funding, and it was so beautiful because he said, if you care about Black and brown kids, you would care about funding for more counselors in schools. If you care about Black and brown kids, you would care about more money for teachers, right? If you care about Black and brown students. So this pandemic trauma that everyone's talking about and saying the poor Black and brown children, this is why we need vouchers, is actually counterproductive because you're taking money from them again, instead of looking at the root cause of what we looked at before the pandemic, which was a disproportionate number of Black and brown kids suffering in underfunded educational systems. And so, you know, like that sounds like a complex thing, but when I take that to the community and bring them in, I'm like, you know, you can't walk away from the conversation of race, and you have to lean into that and let them talk back to you in order for you to get to the root of what really is the problem. Because it's easy on the superficial level when you're talking to folks, especially in underfunded education communities, they will blame a superintendent's salary. They will say that we're spending too much money on et cetera, but they have no clue how the education is funded in their community. And so giving them that context, and then like with Stephen's beautiful report on the Black Belt of Georgia and crossing that over with underfunding in education and poverty, is how you bring community in. And you let them speak to their problem, and we look at the whole child. And so, you know, you can give lip service all day long to Black and brown children, but vouchers are actually counterproductive to saving and helping Black and brown children. So, and what was the second question? Because that was a long one.
I tend to do that. Sorry about that. The second part of that was, what have been some of the challenges associated with bringing this issue of, you know, race and vouchers to the forefront in Georgia?
I think so. The biggest challenge is that folks are unaware. And so when you show up and say vouchers are bad, they say, what's a voucher? And then you have to really you have to ground yourself and say, so let me talk to you about why your school district looks like this, or why this is happening this way, right? And, you know, like I think you did and Stephen did, we all y'all all pinpointed counties that didn't have private schools, but, you know, would be directly impacted by vouchers. Stephen was able to really articulate that bill that we just defeated was really just a bill that was against inner city schools in Atlanta. And those are predominantly Black. And so, you know, you have to have that conversation first and say like, look, I feel this, I hear this, and this is what we found, but let me dig in deeper so you can share your story and tie it into the bigger picture of how we fund education and how we defeat vouchers. So we can make sure we're actually we're really prioritizing those Black and brown kids.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. Bill, did you have something that you wanted to add to that answer?
Well, sure. In Arkansas, the Walton folks, who've the primary drivers of the voucher effort here, have tried so hard to wrap themselves in the around racial equity. If you can look at every other word out of the foundation's mouth is race equity, but what we've been effective at is just showing that the actual outcomes are discriminatory. And then in terms of where the money's going, what students participate. In Arkansas and across the South, we have this long legacy of all white academies that were created after desegregation. And for several years, the drafts of the bill that we defeated session after session would have allowed funding to go to those private academies. This session, their version of the bill for the first time included protections for civil rights against race discrimination, but still allowed discrimination based on disability or other factors. And so they've tried so hard to push this race equity narrative behind what they're proposing with vouchers, and it's just bunk down to the core. And it's been really important to highlight that. It's been really important to have Black and brown parents and teachers and community members leading the voice and speaking out against it and calling it what it is. It's just nothing short of attempting to resegregate our public schools if you look at the way that either charter schools or vouchers that have happened in Arkansas have worked. So I just wanted to add on, so thanks.
That was great, Bill. Thank you so much for adding that and sharing it. So Sharon, I want to turn it back over to you while we're still on this topic of civil rights. So you've shared that voucher advocates in your state have taken to calling school choice the civil rights issue of our time. Given that this phrasing is a gross misuse and misrepresentation of what the true struggle for civil rights in education has historically looked like, can you share more about what types of messaging your organization and your allies are using to counter this idea that the right to receive a voucher is a civil right?
Sure, and I'll just add on to so many of the good things that Amanda and Bill said. I mean, this is such disingenuous, false rhetoric, and it truly is a gross misrepresentation, because a quick look at the history of vouchers shows just how racist that history is, beginning with Brown versus Board of Education and Milton Friedman writing his piece about using vouchers, moving to a marketplace for education. And, vouchers from the beginning were used to facilitate white flight across the South, like Bill mentioned, and to enroll white kids in the segregation academies. So in Arizona, as I mentioned before, these private school voucher programs have just been rammed through under the guise of civil rights, especially this session, to the point where we think it was the American Federation for Children made a video that they showed at the beginning of the voucher expansion bill, in which they had a civil rights activist, 94-year-old civil rights activist from Alabama, who made this claim that school choice and our voucher bill in Arizona is a civil rights issue of our day. We know in Arizona, because we're able to track some of the data, we have zero data in Arizona for how our kids do academically, the kids who use vouchers. We know literally nothing about that. However, we do know that in Arizona, private schools serve significantly fewer students of color than public schools. And while students of color comprise over half of all of Arizona students, only a third of charter and private school students are children of color. So Arizona also has, according to a number of different studies, some of the most inequitable school funding in the country. And we also know that the majority, 2/3, or actually 3/4, 75% of Arizona families who actually use empowerment scholarship account vouchers come from our A and B rated schools, which are, of course, located in comparatively affluent areas. And, so the idea that this is a choice for everyone, right? So for many, many families in Arizona, the best choice, the choice families want to make is that school right down the street. And they want that school in their community to be well funded.
Thank you, Sharon. Bill, we're gonna stick to this topic of civil rights a little bit, but we're gonna focus on a different student population here that's also often negatively and inequitably affected by vouchers, and that's students with disabilities. We know that vouchers have shown to be detrimental for students with disabilities, despite the fact that many programs, including the Succeed Scholarship Program in Arkansas, do not actually help students with disabilities. So how are your organization and its allies centering and incorporating the experiences of students with disabilities in your advocacy against vouchers? And are you able to share with us any examples of what you're seeing and hearing in your state from the disability community?
Sure. I mean, let me back up and just tell a little bit how we got here. When the Succeed Voucher Program, they call it the Succeed Scholarship Program, I call it the Succeed Voucher Program. When they first created it, it had 1,000 flaws, but one of those was that there was absolutely no evaluation of it. And so last legislative session, we worked with our coalition of partners, which includes superintendents and the Arkansas Education Association, some community advocacy groups to push a bill that simply required some evaluation of it. And then actually Sujith saw that evaluation and wrote a letter to the legislature highlighting all the disparities that evaluation exposed in terms of who was getting access to it, higher income, whiter families, and still pretty large lack of data actually on how it was performing for the actual students. We released that, we signed onto the letter with you along with many other groups. We released the letter. A group of parents saw that and contacted us to tell us a story. And the story is about being told that the public schools were failing their children who most of them had dyslexia or some kind of language disorder was the disability that this particular group was targeting. So they're contacted by a school, promised the sun and the moon that the public school is failing their kids is the story they were told. And they were promised the sun and the moon to come over to their school and to sign up for the Succeed voucher program to help pay for it. Well, it turns out that school was not using the curriculum that they promised that they were using. They didn't have certified teachers. Not even all their teachers were degreed. They had no special education coordinator. Basically, every promise the parents were made was failed for them. The school delivered none of what they promised. And so those parents have started working with us to share their story, to sort of expose the program. And then we've been working with them and then again, our other education coalition partners to start to identify all of the problems within the program in terms of there's still no transparency and accountability for kind of the achievement of the students that they're trying to serve. There's still no transparency about who gets these vouchers and who doesn't. And the system looks like it's rigged. So it kind of the families that are in the know or have political favors. The program's run by a nonprofit that was created by the Walton Foundation and is run by the lead lobbyist for the Walton Foundation. The first couple of years, the address of the nonprofit was her home. And so the whole thing is just sort of rigged. So we're in the process of exposing all of the myriad of problems that have happened, both within the analysis that was required from the bill that we have passed and that you did an incredible job of sort of lifting up in that letter, but then also documenting the story of these parents and the impact on their kids and their families as a whole. I mean, it's heartbreaking. I mean, some of these families were promised so much that they were driving 2 to 3 hours each direction to come to this school. And the school was just outright lying to them about the curriculum, about the teacher qualification, about everything. But they were happy to take the money. The other thing I'll just say about the Succeed voucher program that's particularly insidious, two other things that are particularly insidious. First of all, the Waltons picked the most vulnerable students and families and the most desperate families in the state to use as an attempt to get the camel's nose under the tent around vouchers. And these students have been used from the very get-go to try to be the template for how to do vouchers in Arkansas. And we've been very successful at blocking the many attempts to create a broad-based voucher program in the state. And the reality is that our special education system in the state, by a state's own commission report, is underfunded by at least $100 million. But instead of addressing the $100 million shortfall in the special education budget, they just thought, well, we'll create this $4 million little vanity project for the Waltons and use that as the nose under the tent. So families are not being served by the public education system in all cases because they don't have anywhere near the resources. The other thing that's important to know about these voucher programs that are particularly targeted at students with disabilities is the numbers just don't work. Students with disabilities are expensive to serve, particularly as their disabilities are more pronounced. But this voucher program and many of the others around the country only awards these private schools the base foundation funding. So in Arkansas this year, that'll be $7,000 per year. Well, there's no way you can actually address the myriad of needs that many special education students need for $7,000. Whereas in the public school system, you are, the school is responsible for delivering on whatever that student needs, whatever the cost. The last thing, Sujith, I'm sorry, I got wound up. The last thing I want to say about this that's insidious about the Succeed voucher program and the other voucher programs that they've attempted to pass in the state is they require the parents and the students to sign away their rights under IDEA, under any other civil rights protections. And so when the school fails to deliver for the students, the parents have no recourse. There's nowhere to go. You can't hold them accountable in all the ways that you could hold any other school accountable for not meeting your students' needs. And many parents don't really understand what they're signing away when they sign those documents. I asked one of them the other day who said she felt silly for not understanding what she was signing away. And I asked her when the last time she read every page of her mortgage was. I mean, you get handed a stack of papers, you have a slick salesperson selling you on the thing, and you just start signing away because you believe the person who's telling you this. And it turns out in a lot of cases, at least in our schools that are taking these voucher programs, they are misleading, if not outright lying to many parents.
And that's incredibly insidious. You actually answered the next question I had for you, Bill.
Oh, sorry, I kind of got off on a tear there. I apologize.
No, it's great. I think you shared a lot of amazing information there. So I'll tweak it a little bit because you brought up a point about incorporating parents into the discussion and parent voices. And I was wondering, whether you've seen that parents are reluctant to come forward, for whatever reason, or if you found it fairly easy to collect a large number of parent voices in this fight against vouchers in Arkansas.
Who do you know that wants to stand up against the most wealthy, powerful lobby group in the state, if not in the country, in terms of the Walton family? So yeah, we found it hard to find parents who are willing to share their stories for a whole bunch of reasons. One, that's an awful lot of power to stand up against. Luckily, we have a lot of mad mamas who are willing to do it, and some mad dads too. We've also found some retired teachers and some active teachers who are just disgusted with what they're seeing, because you don't go into teaching for the money. You go into teaching because it's your passion. And there's a lot of teachers who are really well grounded in the science of teaching. And one of our kind of best arguments against the voucher schemes has been they just don't work. At the end of the day, there's just no evidence that they work. If you want to look at, the proposal that by the way, we defeated another voucher proposal today in the Arkansas House. It passed through our committee yesterday, but we managed to defeat it today. But the biggest argument, again, there's a lot of really good arguments against it, but the biggest argument against it is that if you have $10 million, which is the cost of this particular program today, if you have $10 million to spend on education, vouchers is like literally the last thing on the list. We have $100 million in special education needs. We don't spend a dime in Arkansas on after school and summer programs, which are so proven to be effective. We haven't increased our funding for our early childhood education program in years. We're not spending enough on teacher quality. The teacher pay gap between our wealthy school districts and our lower income school districts is wider than it's ever been historically. And in Arkansas, inequity is kind of part of our DNA. So it's been wide in the past, but it's more pronounced now than it's ever been. And so those are the biggest reasons that we've used to speak against the vouchers. And I heard, I think it was Stephen or Stephen, I forget, but talk about it. It was not just being against vouchers. If you're just against vouchers, the Waltons have been really expert at framing you as, well, you're just a teacher trying to protect their job, or you're just a superintendent trying to protect your institution, and you don't really care about kids. And we've come right back at them in their face. And if you care about kids, there's a giant list of science-based, research-based things that we should be doing that improve equity, that improve performance for everybody, that are far more effective than vouchers. And by the way, all of your proposals are discriminatory and biased. That's been the kind of the core of our argument and coming back at them. But parent voices and those community voices have been absolutely vital. We haven't had the massive numbers of them, but where we've had them, you know, we tell parents all the time, your story, your perspective is so much more powerful than those fancy dressed lobbyists, because it's authentic and it's just, it rings more true than anything else. And so those parent stories have been really critical to our success.
Thanks for that, Bill. And while you were sharing, what really came to mind was that this voucher issue is really a case of misplaced priorities. You know, when your state has all these other needs, there's so many millions of dollars each year going to these voucher programs. Stephen, the next question is for you. So your work requires you to be knowledgeable about and aware of the research and policy implications of school vouchers. And you've shared a little bit about that this evening. As we've discussed, however, organizing and messaging are a huge part of winning the fight against school privatizers, and being inundated with data and facts and national studies can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming to people who aren't a part of that world and who want to know how this issue affects them specifically and personally. So in your organizing, how do you make a concrete connection between the research and data on vouchers that you publish and also the experiences of real people?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big part of my work is researching these sorts of policies, how their intersection with education funding, the role of public education. But I mean, to Bill's point, anytime I'm responding to like kind of a pro voucher point and replying to actually, no, you know, those test scores need to be, you know, tied to income, you're losing the fight a lot of time. That needs to exist. There has to be that body of knowledge of why these are bad policy on all these other ways. But I am definitely of the mind that is really just window dressing in these arguments that go deeper into what's the purpose of public funding? How do we share public spaces? Who deserves to get to be in those public spaces and get to have like a full share of the pie? And so we spend so much of our time, especially the rest of the year, just trying to show what's at the root of the issue. To Bill's point, are you concerned about students with disabilities? That I'm with you. I also am concerned about the education of students with disabilities, but this ain't it. Are you concerned about how kids with low-income parents are doing in public schools? You're 100% right to be concerned about that, but we don't have a weight in our funding formula to specifically educate students living in poverty. And you can go down the line. We were talking about, you know, how we felt like voucher advocates had this in during the pandemic, that, you know, every parent needs a little help. You know, we're struggling with schools opening and closing. But there have been policies in place for years that could support these families. There's an earned income tax credit. There's like, we need a robust safety net. We need to expand Medicaid. The idea that like, okay, now we're going to just do one thing for families that are struggling. Like, no. Giving some families a discount coupon to a private school is not it. And that $3,000 or whatever it is, that's not going to get you into the private school of your choice. And then I've been asked this in interviews before, like, okay, what changes would you make to be like okay with vouchers? And I thought about it like, well, okay, you know, let's talk discrimination, let's talk funding, let's talk location, let's talk the role of the public space. And then I just created public schools again. Like, we're not going to fund two separate school systems in Georgia when we're not even funding the first one correctly. And so that's what we really just like, I don't want to go into that arena at all. I want to be spinning like, how can we talk about like us funding this private school down the street when the schools that 1.7 million children go to right now aren't funded because no one has had a great meal at a steakhouse and then just said like, oh, that was great. I wish there was another steakhouse right next door. I just wish there was a choice for another one. You know what I mean? It's just, it falls apart when you start to show and kind of like direct to like, what is the root of these arguments? Because then you can at times get people to realize that like, oh, it's just cheaper. Like, or, oh, it's just going to help me subsidize doing something that I'm already doing myself. And that's an arena that we're going to have more success in.
That's a great point, and I really like the framing of, you know, addressing the systemic inequities rather than just kind of picking and choosing these small things to go after with these, you know, discount coupons. Which, by the way, love that framing. That's amazing. Reverend Schaffer, the next question is for you. So the work of organizations like Pastors for Florida's Children is so critical because it involves mobilizing faith leaders around public education issues, including opposition to vouchers, as you do. As an organizing force for the faith community, your group also has a unique ability to reach parents and families who may be dissatisfied with their child's experience in the voucher program. And we often see that many of these pro-voucher organizations bring children receiving vouchers and their parents into legislative hearings and other spaces to advocate in their favor. How is your organization working to capture more parent and family voices on our side of the issue? And how can we amplify those voices of families who are actually being served well by Florida's public schools?
Right. So gathering narratives of those who have experienced these private schools that they've used a voucher for is challenging. And so look at one side of the issue, right? Step Up for Students, which is the organization in Florida that houses the $1 billion of voucher funding, right? That is taken out of the public trust. They have it easy. They just have to go down their roster. Everybody on their list has received a voucher, right? So who are the most compelling stories? And those are the ones, and they've got that $1 billion pot of money sitting right there. They can send them to the Capitol, they can get them there, fund it, and have those stories told in front of legislators and all others. For us, we have to sort through almost 3 million public school students, right? To find who are the ones who have pulled out of public school and tried one of these voucher schools, and then realize these stories are out there in spades. They are there, and we've heard them so many times through the years. But you know, getting parents, you know, to come forward and share them is difficult, and finding them, making sure we connect with the people who have a story that they want to share. Oftentimes parents will feel ashamed, you know, because they feel like, well, you know, I should have known that I couldn't send my child to a private school that would actually meet their needs on my budget. And so even with the voucher, I should have known that. And so then their child ended up having a negative impact. They come back to the public school and they're ashamed and they're not interested in sharing their story. And so, so what we have done is we have added, I'm gonna put it in the chat. We have added a portion on our website where people can go and report a school or a personal narrative where they had a negative impact by attending one of these schools. And, you know, we're very clear, you know, for us as pastors, as ministers, as laity in churches, we know about confidentiality. We're very willing to say, whatever it is you don't want us to share, we will never share. But these stories are important. And so we have to get them out. And so that's one way that we're able to collect stories. I would love to share one with you if we have time for that, because it shows you, you know, we're hearing very compelling stories from the other side, and it's important to share our side of the story. So one example is Anthony. He lived in Miami. His mom worked in fast food restaurants. The school where the church where he had been attending after school programming opened a private school. And so he decided to attend, even though his family had to pay an extra $25 a month on top of the voucher out of his mom's meager salary in order to make it work. And so a local advocate who had known Anthony for years went to check out the school. It was housed in a rundown, abandoned, inadequate education wing of an inner city Miami church. The teachers were all members of the church. They did not have education degrees or even teaching certificates. And so he attended this school for 2 years, his 2 final years of high school, after attending public school all prior to that. At the end of his time there, he was pressured to apply for college, even though his SAT scores did not reflect that he was college ready. He tried a small private college in North Carolina, but he was not prepared. So he had to return home to Miami without a diploma. He was also in debt. He tried again to talk to admissions at a well-respected Miami area college, known for its support of first-generation college students like Anthony. When the admissions counselor reviewed his high school transcripts, what he heard back was, "We would never accept you here." to us, your high school degree is worthless. That is what we are doing to our children. That's on us as a state, that we have allowed funds from our public trust to go towards a school that gives a child who has worked their heart out to transcend what their life experience has been in their family, and to try to go to college, and then their diploma is told to them is worthless. That's on us that we've allowed that to happen. And so, we're not okay with that. And so we're going to continue fighting this no matter what it takes.
Thank you for sharing that story, Reverend Shepard. And chances are Anthony's story isn't singular. Chances are there are thousands more stories out there like Anthony, and thousands more that are falling through the cracks. And so we really need to do something about that. Amanda, the last.
I'm sorry, I was just going to interject. In Arkansas, it's the same, that our Succeed voucher program, those schools do not need to be accredited. So I know that story is happening over and over again.
Thank you, Bill. So Amanda, the last question is for you, and then we'll go ahead and move on to some great questions that we have from attendees. So as the Director of Strategic Campaigns for GBPI, you bring extensive organizing experience to this fight against vouchers. How do we communicate and organize around this issue in a way that's inclusive, productive, and informative for folks who don't know which side to take? And this has been touched on a little bit in the panel so far, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, given your extensive experience in communications. And also, what can I'll hold off on the second part. So go ahead and answer the first part.
So in just general organizing, you have to give a space for people to be brave. And I think when you have these moments when you're like, we're going to fight a Goliath of education system, you have to figure out the strategy is to just get people comfortable in saying that I want to talk, I want to share my piece. And then developing an apparatus. So it's either a coalition or it's a campaign, looking for funding in order to share those stories and be able to talk to other folks who are like a consultant in research and data. I mean, I wouldn't say lobbyists. I think people can be citizen lobbyists as well, but really like identifying, what our main goal is and setting those ground rules, and then moving forward as loud and as brave as you can. I think also understanding that it is incremental wins in the education fight. And you've got to be in this for the long haul, because for so long, no one's going to stand up and say, hey, I messed up education in Georgia. Sorry, my bad. That's not going to happen. They're going to keep doing what they're doing because that's all they know. And that's what's given to them. So in this organizing and this coalition build, the fight is to show them that there's something better and that parents want something better. I think it's easy for them to dismiss it and say that's not happening. But if you show up with, 5,000 postcards and you drop it on a legislator's desk, if you're sending multiple emails, or if you have a direct action as far as a protest or a march around the Capitol, or you're showing that, no, we care about this and we're going to speak up. That's how you begin it. And then you can build out whatever that apparatus looks like in order to support that work in a more organized way. But I think first and foremost, you have to create a brave space, because everyone from teachers to superintendents to parents to students are afraid of the blowback, and they don't want to ruin their lives because they decided to speak their truth.
Thanks so much for that, Amanda. So we do have some great questions for the panelists from attendees so far that have participated in the conversation. And so I have one question here, and anyone can choose to answer it on the panel. It says, could anyone on the panel talk about experiences with ballot initiatives around vouchers or school funding? Go for it, Sharon.
I'm happy to jump in there. Like I said before, Save Our Schools Arizona referred a bill. We collected tens of thousands of signatures to get that on the ballot, really with volunteers, and sort of picking up on some of what Amanda was saying, like finding that, I love that idea of a brave space for people, right? Like, so whatever people could do when we were doing that campaign, however they could pitch in, if it was behind the scenes, if it was circulating petitions, that's what we did. And Save Our Schools a year ago, before the pandemic hit, was going to put an initiative on the ballot that would have really curtailed the number of ESAs allowed and added accountability and transparency to that. But because of COVID, we were unable to make that happen because we couldn't be out circulating petitions, and we're not an organization that has hundreds of thousands of dollars to hire circulators for us. I do think that it's an enormous amount of work, but it's also a way to get a lot of people in their communities involved and having a say and a stake in what's happening, what's on the ballot, and hopefully to advocate for issues that are, near and dear to their hearts and to their communities.
Thanks so much, Sharon. The next question that we have on here from an attendee is, in Indiana, Republican legislators totally support vouchers while Democratic legislators support public schools. How can we get Republicans who are supportive of vouchers to side with us? Even if one or two Republican legislators change their votes to support public schools, it would help the fight.
So I'd love to jump in on that. Speaking from experience in Florida, I would just say you can't. We can't get them to side with us. And I am not saying that because they're Republicans. I don't care what party you are, honestly. I'm talking about, do you vote in support of public schools? And regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on politically, if you're a Democrat and you are not supporting for public schools, we need to vote you out. Because if you're not listening time and time again, and so that is how you get them to listen and side with you. You have to speak with your vote. In Florida, that is the case. We cannot get them to hear us, no matter what we say, no matter how much evidence we bring. They are not hearing us. They are not listening. And people continue to vote in such, it's not that they don't support public schools, because we know that 2/3 of people, when you ask them, when you poll them, 2/3 of voters think that funding for public schools should be increased, not decreased. And they are in support of our public schools. So it's not that they don't care about public schools or don't want our public schools supported. But the legislators are not listening to the people. And so what do we do when they don't listen to us? We say, you can't be here anymore because you are not responding to what we're asking you to do. So that's all I got, because we're seeing it firsthand year after year after year. They continue to siphon funds away from the public trust. So regardless of your party, if you are not supporting public schools and you show that to us time and time again, we have to have you exit the building.
Thank you, Reverend. Bill, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree with that so much. And I think sadly, what we're seeing is an attack on the bipartisan consensus around public education. In Arkansas, we've had a strong bipartisan consensus around supporting public education. Our Supreme Court here found our system of education unconstitutionally unequal and inept in 2002. And some of you may remember that Mike Huckabee used to be our governor, very conservative Republican, but he and our Democratic at the time controlled legislature worked together, and we increased our funding for education over $1 billion. And we moved rapidly, the quality of education as measured by test scores, which is imperfect in its own way, but we were improving rapidly as a result of those investments. And what the folks like the Waltons have done, or Americans for Prosperity, is they are really trying to drive a polarizing wedge to make this a partisan issue because it's in their interest. So here in Arkansas, one of our most strong proponents against vouchers in the last session, she gave this incredible speech from the well of the House to defeat the voucher bill last session, just because it's wrong. And it was her personal conviction that it's wrong. And the Waltons targeted her in her Republican primary with an unholy amount of money that's never been spent in a primary in the Republican Party in the state, or probably the Democratic either. And they defeated her. And they touted it loudly on all their channels that we beat her because of her voucher vote. And the message to other Republicans is, you better get in line. And luckily what we saw today was still a majority of Republicans in our House still rejected this voucher bill, even after those investments from the Waltons in the last election cycle. And they did it though, because some of them are educators or they're the children of educators. And that we still, in our state, we're such a rural place that many are still super connected to their rural schools, which is such a vital part of our community. But the Waltons are now going to target those folks in the primaries. And so it's not only a matter of we need to hold those lawmakers accountable for voting in the public interest, but we also need to counter this massive influx of outside money from Americans for Prosperity and the Waltons and the other folks who are trying to polarize this issue around a partisan basis, because if they can divide us on party, then they win. And we've got to really work hard to try to maintain the bipartisan consensus around the value of public education.
Thanks for lifting that up, Bill.
Do you mind if I add on to that too?
Sure, go for it, Stephen.
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what Bill said. We have had some success in that area with specifically rural Republicans in Georgia, but I think that it's nothing special in Georgia except for the fact that we just haven't had the big voucher expansion thus far, and so there's no momentum behind that. And so anytime we have success, it usually involves like trying to make sure it just doesn't go up for a vote so that people don't have to put their names on the line, you know, whether or not they're a good soldier. And we're trying our best to make sure that we're reaching out to people whom specifically rural Republicans are more likely to listen to, which is not the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and it's local superintendents. And it is teachers and parents in the communities. And so we just try to snowball it up. You call your superintendent and then have him or her call the legislators. I mean, we had one lawmaker up in North Georgia in the middle of the voucher hearing, got a text from his superintendent, and he was just like, hey, listen, and she says differently. Like she was watching it on TV, watching it, and she texted him about it, and that changed his vote right then and there. I mean, he's a powerful Republican in the House, and we heard about that all the time. Is that we spent like about a week reaching out to school leaders specifically to then, and Democrats needed to hear it too. Honestly, we had some in-town Democrats who were like, they needed to hear it from their folks too, because yeah, it's easy to lump in the hundreds of thousands of votes if you can say like, oh, those are just teacher groups or oh, those are just, you know, like those are just PTAs, even though that's completely unfair. It is a lot harder to have the superintendent that, you know, welcomes you in the Kiwanis Club meeting who goes to church with you. It's a lot harder to ignore him or her.
Or your pastor. We need to get pastors for Georgia children up and running. I know
Let's go.
Let's talk.
Yes, we do. Well, we have one more audience question in the chat. And Reverend Shepard, I think you might be uniquely positioned to answer this one, but if not, anyone else is welcome to as well. So this question says, in Wisconsin, the religious community is saving their church budgets and allowing their schools to stay open because of vouchers. They're recruiting families to get a voucher to go to their private/church schools. Is that happening in Florida, or for our other panelists, Georgia, Arkansas, or Arizona?
I mean, we definitely have seen schools, you know, marketing the fact that they're staying open during the pandemic when our public schools are closed. We've definitely seen that. We've seen another thing that isn't specific to the pandemic, but we've seen where honestly churches are dying and they utilize the voucher program as a means to save their church. And so, you know, they're using that money to hold on to that space as a church instead of for the best interests of children. That's not the case in all of these schools, but it is happening, and we cannot use money from the public trust for that. Ultimately, we at Pastors for Florida Children are strong, staunch believers in separation of church and state. So we don't believe money should ever be going out of the public trust, you know, in a way. I mean, religion is voluntary. That's a choice that we each make personally. And so it should not be advanced by our state funding in any way, shape, or form. But yes, it's happening. It is very troubling. And all we can do at this point is call it out. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, my parents are deeply Catholic, and I went to a Catholic school. But my father knew that his religious conviction didn't forgive him of his social duty to fund public education for everybody else. And I think that's a powerful argument for folks in the religious community. I have no problem with parochial education or religious education, but you can't move your child's education forward at the cost of someone else's. And that's a deeply held Catholic social justice belief that my parents had, even as they put some of us through Catholic school. Being a Catholic family, we had a lot of kids, so not all of us got to go to Catholic school because it is expensive. But and then, you know, I was just going to add, you know, in Arkansas, many of our private schools are religious. But, you know, frankly, most of the high quality religious schools are much, much more expensive than the voucher. And so really again, here, they've crafted their proposals to try to make it seem as though they're tailored for low income families. But there's a parochial Episcopal school down the street from my house. It's $18,000 a year. The $7,000 voucher, I mean, that's why I really like the framing of a discount coupon, because that's really what it is. And those $17,000 and $18,000 elite private schools have no intention of allowing anybody in. They are able to charge that tuition because they are exclusionary, and they've never designed to be inclusive institutions.
Thanks so much for that, Bill. Those are all the audience questions that we have so far. So I'll go ahead and start closing us out. And afterwards, I'll bring Jessica Levin from PFPS back on so she can do a final closeout for us. So again, thank you so much to everyone for tuning in to this webinar this evening. Thank you to those of you who participated and asked wonderful and thought-provoking questions. And thank you to our panelists for sharing the space with us and lending your expertise to the conversation this evening. I learned a lot from listening to y'all, so just thank you so much. Our panelists shared how advocacy in this space can be inclusive of different identities and communities. They shared what's working in their states and also how it can be applied to other places. And importantly, they provided a call to action to oppose vouchers and protect public schools in a year when public schools need all the support they can get. The collective insight shared by the panelists provides a blueprint and a path forward to mount a strong, unified opposition to school vouchers and present a vision for a more equitable and just public education system, and also one that's more well-funded in the United States. We really appreciate your time and attention throughout this webinar. Have a great evening and take care, and I'll bring Jessica back on to do a final closeout for us.
Well, I simply want to thank Sujith for leading this terrific discussion. PFPS is very grateful to have Southern Education Foundation as a powerful ally in our fight against vouchers. And as has been demonstrated once again tonight, the work of keeping public funds in public schools would not be possible without the energetic, brilliant, tireless efforts of all of our allies in the states. So thank you to those of you who are on our panel today for sharing your experiences and your wisdom and some of your recent victories that you and your organizations have had, which are inspiring to all of us. And thank you to all of the additional advocates and allies who are in our audience tonight. So please remember to sign up on the PFPS website to stay connected and to receive updates on our upcoming webinars. We look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Have a good evening.